interestingly, the report that you mentioned did talk a lot about moving the debate around personal data, or around data in general, from collection to usage. The challenge at that time was people fearful of big data companies, or any company for that matter, collecting data in fear that it might fall into the wrong hands. So that's a security issue. We heard from Dana, we heard actually from Jorge as well, that securing that and making sure that it's safe is an imperative, certainly to any business model going forward. So for the sake of this debate, let's assume that security is in place and works, right? So therefore, we can now focus on usage and look at the positive aspects. Now, that doesn't mean security is fixed. I don't want to give anyone that impression, but I think for the use case and how we look at this and see the positive and the economic benefits and social benefits, I think we have to assume that that gets fixed through the right mechanisms. Dana, as we were talking back there, you were thinking of a number of key use cases where data can be used quite positively. Now, one of the dimensions I just want to throw out there before you get into that is, we use this term personal data, but yet we don't define it. And I reckon each one of us, as well as many of you, might have different definitions of where personal data starts and stops, and therefore that makes consent and what consent represents difficult. Within that, though, there are still very positive, already probably implied consent opportunities. So Dana, maybe you want to talk about some of those that you see that you track as MasterCard in how payments are processed, that's giving you insights that are beyond just, okay, a lot of people have spent money.
Right. Thank you, Alan. So we think about data and the use of data to help us make business decisions, to help us look at areas of growth, to help us look at areas of concern, and also to drive social good, which we'll talk about in a little bit later. One of the things, although we were assuming security is and everything is safe, I will tell you one of the big use cases of big data is in the security and safety space of payments, keeping payments safe. It's an imperative for MasterCard, it's imperative for all of us. There's a lot of value in data in order to keep payments safe. MasterCard as a brand, as a franchise, as a global payments company, has a responsibility to be able to look at the fraud space and the risk space, and to be able to use technology and to use data in order to help drive value. For example, we're able and we're obligated really to understand fraudulent activity on MasterCard products and offerings. We have a huge, let me call it data lake, around what fraud looks like and how fraud has been enacted on our payment vehicles. We also, of course, through the provision of the Global Payments Network, have another big repository of data of what good looks like, what good transactions look like. And we all know data, technology advances, tools that are in the industry allow us to see patterns, to detect things, to use fuzzy logic and neural network technology, artificial intelligence, all the amalgamation of the technology advances to help us detect patterns. So we leverage this data in order to identify patterns. We can do segmentation, we can do predictive modeling. We do this in the aggregate, and we can apply that. We can do scoring of individual transactions and coupling the ability to leverage the data to be able to see that, to see the patterns with the footprint that we have of a global payments network that's connected in 210 countries and territories around the globe. We're able to take risk models and risk scores on each and every transaction and apply them in real time to benefit the issuer of the card product, the individual, the company that has the relationship with the consumer. We can apply data to the transaction prior to them making the authorization decision that will help them make a better decision to be able to see fraud patterns. So that's a very valuable and relevant way to use the data in a use case. I tell you another very valuable use of fraud predictive capability is we can look backwards into data. As fraud is perpetrated, we can look for patterns of perhaps where was that perpetrated, where was the point of compromise prior to the fraud being occurring. That also helps us, and we work certainly with law enforcement and governmental officials in order to identify where there may be a point of compromise. So I know I'm sort of in that security space, but there's quite some value in the ability to really apply big data and technology and tools coupled with the ability to have the railroad tracks, so to speak, in real time to be able to help all stakeholders make better decisions about transactions and decisioning. So that's just one. I could go on, Alan. There's many others.
Well, we can have other people have a chance. Joel, you were talking also in terms of transport, in terms of other kinds of uses. So certainly one question I have is how do you look at data from personal versus more anonymized, and then how does that get used for more successful growth, not just in terms of economic or for your own company, but even in terms of some of the social good like transport and interconnected costs for urban services?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the things to realize is the way Microsoft looks at data, because we are a big provider of cloud services where we are the stewards of a lot of data that's out there. We believe that the data belongs to the people that own the systems that create the data, whether it's a consumer or whether it happens to be the private enterprise. What we do want to do is be able to, a statement I made earlier, which is we want to enable the use of technology where technology makes sense to maximize efficiencies. And in the space that I tend to deal with from a government perspective, very heavily from a public safety and justice perspective, the role of data, especially in big data and analytics, helps organizations achieve the mission for which they have. Dana was talking a bit about fraudulent activity that's occurring within their systems and how they're able to identify what they are and try to provide better levels of service. We tend to see very similar activities in the areas of taxation. So governments that are looking to provide taxation systems for their users, we're seeing a lot of systems that are now automated, that are online types of capabilities. But what we find is by being able to look at the use of data and being able to identify certain types of activities, we can help organizations identify what they would consider to be fraudulent tax processing in those areas, which ultimately leads to ensuring that the right financial models are occurring in the government. So again, reducing any criminal activity or helping people who just happen to make a mistake or not know the right taxation processes that are out there. Where we're also seeing, though, a dramatic increase in big data usage are around areas where lots of data is generated. And Alan, you mentioned transportation. That tends to be one of the areas that we spend a lot of time working with transportation organizations on. And a lot of it has to do with the flow of traffic and the management of traffic. But a lot of it also has to do with just becoming more efficient with the resourcing that they use. And I'll give an example. Recently we worked with the city government of Helsinki, Finland. And one of the things they were trying to do were, they were doing their budgeting cycles. They were looking at their 3-year plan, their 5-year plan, their 20-year plan. And what they realized was with the urbanization models that are occurring and more people moving into the city center, they needed to have a better operation for their transportation systems. And while many organizations, many city leaders are looking at things like electric buses, light rail types of systems, better use of bicycle lanes and things like that, there's still the existing systems in place that have to be supported. And one of the things the Helsinki city did was they took a look at their bus system and they said, we have a lot of information that's collected because every bus has a small box that collects data. And at the end of the bus run, they dump the data and it goes into a database, but they've never really looked at the data other than when there's an issue on a bus. They have a recurring flat tire on a specific part of the bus. They'll try to figure out where that's occurring or things like that. But what they did was they took the data and they used some very simple tools. And in fact, in just the current version of Microsoft Excel, there's a new heat map tool, something we call Power BI, that allows you literally to just say, take the data and anything that has a geographic coordinate, just display it on a map. Let me just take a look at where the data tends to reside. And the thing that immediately appeared was that there were two heat map points that appeared on the bus data. And what it was showing was where fuel usage spikes were occurring. There were two locations. And so they said, well, we wonder why that's occurring. And they went and they talked to the bus drivers and they said, do you know any reason why you are accelerating heavily in these particular places? And the bus drivers of this particular route said, well, yeah, there's a railroad line that actually goes through the middle of the city. And the road has deteriorated through time. And as the bus driver, I have to slow the bus very quickly so that I don't have a jar, a bump in the bus. And when I get to the other side, I then accelerate quickly to get back up to speed, to maintain the timing of my route. And what they found was that, and there were a lot of discussions. Maybe they changed the behavior of the bus driver to, decelerate slower, accelerate slower. But what they found was, by just changing the road surface, by literally fixing the road around the rail lines, they were able to increase their efficiency and fuel usage on that bus line by 5%. Now, you might say 5% is not that big in a city, but it equates to 150,000 gallons of fuel every year. So just by a simple process of taking existing data, placing it into a heat map environment, they were able to very quickly and visually understand that they had an issue and then try to address that particular issue. We're seeing that same model now being applied in public safety, where they're looking at places where criminal activity occurs. There are even companies now that are building predictive models to suggest, based on weather patterns, times of year, where they think the crime will be, and thus asking law enforcement officers to either change their patrol routes or to use the video camera systems that may already be on the street corners or on buses or taxis to start collecting information so they can try to reduce criminal activity in specific areas. So we're seeing big opportunities that are occurring everywhere around. In this case, it's from a city space, but as I mentioned on the tax side, it's at the federal government aspect as well. And what we're doing is we're trying to work with organizations to expose that data, to leverage the data that they have, and work with other organizations to look for either anomalies that they could address or areas where they can collaborate and work together to better take advantage of the data that they have.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, a cost efficiency brought out of the data, a public good, certainly the transport system, and the ability to look for other efficiencies that can maybe translate to even better service and site.
Yeah, and just on a side note, the customer satisfaction on that particular bus route went up 20% just by changing the road surface. So there's a direct correlation to customer satisfaction in that case, which becomes a return on votes during the political process as well.
Indeed. And if for some reason there were rules or regulatory issues on collecting that data and using it in that way, we would never have found such an opportunity.
Yeah, we believe that having policies in place that support the greater good of the data is appropriate, but we also realize that no city or no government at the federal or central level knows all of the rules that will apply. The world is changing so quickly, so forums like this are a perfect opportunity to engage and discuss.
So, Bill, you're talking about the need to have consent and control information, and how important that is, particularly in health, because as all of us probably think, there's certain things about our health and our healthcare maybe we don't want to be known by certain others or even maybe anybody. But the notion of being able to deliver some of that information for the greater good of health in society, the trade-offs, and how do we look at consent, and what are those opportunities if we do it well, and how do we convince people then that consent is actually better for them as well as for society? And kind of to the point that Joel made, different rules, right? Health information is not transport information, it's not payment information. Is it okay that there are different rules for different kinds of data in different places at different times?
So health information is more sensitive. And people are very concerned about it, and with good reason. But it's interesting, if you talk to people about their privacy concerns relative to health information, they basically fall into two big categories. The first category is, I just don't want anyone to know about this. This is embarrassing, or I'm worried about it, or of course, in the U.S., we have the problem of discrimination in the job market and potentially for health insurance, which is not a factor elsewhere. But there's this real sense that I don't want people to know about this information. That's not the majority. In my experience, the majority of concerns about healthcare privacy go like this. I know that X organization is taking my information, aggregating it with other people's information, and making money, and I'm not getting any. It's really a sense of equity. And this has boiled over into other domains. Facebook has faced this problem. Some of you may remember their Beacon product, which they had to get rid of. And there's this sense that people have that if an organization aggregates my information with a bunch of other people's information and uses it, that may be okay with me, but I feel that something of mine has been taken. And yes, maybe I agreed to that in this privacy policy that was many, many pages long, but I still don't like it. But as you point out, so consent can help with that. But as you point out, and particularly with health information, it can be life-saving in terms of recognizing patterns. One recent example of that is several years ago, the painkiller Vioxx was pulled from the market. And that occurred because of analysis of data. No one person understood this, but actually there was a large healthcare organization that had electronic records, and they were looking to see which of these types of painkillers were better in heart patients. And they analyzed the data, and they found that when people got Vioxx, the death rates were higher, and they thought it was a mistake and ran it over and over, and finally contacted the regulatory authorities, and it was pulled from the market. So this can really be life-saving. So I think the way to approach this is, again, in an environment where people have an account where they have all their health information that is under their control, you ask them if that information can be aggregated with other people's information into truly anonymized reports that are used for research and policy. But you say to them, of course, you realize, we realize that we are going to be selling that information, and therefore, if you agree to do this, we will give some of the revenue from these sales to you on a pro rata basis. It's like interest in a bank. When the bank takes all our deposits, loans them out, collects interest, we get, or we hope we get, some small part of it, but we understand that the reason the bank isn't charging us more for our accounts is because they're using that interest to pay for the infrastructure of the bank. So it's transparent, and there's an interesting survey done by the U.S. Institute of Medicine. They asked people across the country, would you be willing to have your medical information used for research without your consent? 1% of respondents said yes. And then they said, would you be willing to allow your information to be used for research with your consent? Over 80% said yes. So people understand this. People want their information used, but they want to be asked.
They want to be asked. That's a good point. Now, let me just ask another kind of side question to that. Whenever one looks at the notion of opt-in versus opt-out kinds of consent, we see overwhelmingly that a opt-out model tends to have much more favorable results. Certainly in the U.S. with driver's license, one of the things many people see is the ability to be an organ donor, right? When you make it just default yes, and you have to opt out, you have a much higher percentage. In states that are an opt-in, you have a much lower percentage. So is consent an opt-in, or can consent be an opt-out in the notion that you just put forward?
So from my perspective, with medical information, the consent should always be opt-in.
Has to be opt-in.
That you should always ask people. And there are a lot of arguments against opt-in. The one you just made is one of them. But I think with medical information, you have to take the time to ask people, But then you have to explain to them why they should opt in, and you have to give them some reason to opt in. And I think in an environment where you ask people if their information can be aggregated for research, and you give them an economic benefit, even a small one, so that they feel some equity in the process, I think people will, in general, say yes. The other objection you get to opt in is it's just too much trouble to ask people. And I think that's a pretty weak argument. I think you should be asking people. And if there may be some important public purpose that in certain circumstances deserves an opt-out. For example, perhaps being an organ donor is so important to society as a whole that our elected representatives decide that it should be opt-out. But I would argue that is also individual consent, or you can call it community consent, where our elected representatives have decided on our behalf that we're going to consent to this. So essentially, you have no use of information, no use of opt-out without consent.
Interesting. Jorge, as an operator, a telecom operator in multiple countries, the issue of data collection under different rules and different regulations. You mentioned earlier, abiding by the rules of the country in which you're in. You spoke of Mexico particularly. How do you reconcile that in being able to create the kinds of values that we're hearing here? When you create bigger data sets, when you can learn from one place to another, where even Bill's point, where maybe in some jurisdictions you can legislate a particular opt-in, and in other jurisdictions it's very different. How do you work through those things, and how do you find benefit to give back to the number of customers that you would have globally in terms of an operator, and actually being an intersection of so many different kinds of applications and data running on that? We have a microphone problem?
Keep talking.
Try again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it working?
Yes.
Okay, it's very hard to hear you from here. There's sort
I
of
know,
an
it's
echo.
terrible, I know.
Okay, but what we basically do is precisely to identify and separate the information that is generated in the process of the communications, particularly in our industry, which is the mobile services. The kind of information that comes from just delivering the service to the consumer is enormous. Actually, the recent reform on telecommunications has some obligation on us to share information with the authorities. And we have to provide all the information we have about the consumer for 2 years. And that means how many phone calls, SMS, internet connections has the consumer done, where he did it. Because we had to keep the information on the antenna, it got connected. So analyzing those data, the authorities can actually know the behavior patterns of the consumer. Where did he sleep every night? What's the routes they usually follow to get to the job or with relatives and so on? There are tons of information embedded there. And, we are trying still to establish the rules to provide that information. It's a new obligation now, and we have to be very careful with it. But that gives you an idea of all the information that is generated here. But we put a strong division on the information that can identify a particular individual from the information that can be used to identify some patterns that might be useful for the provision of services, and to have a more efficient arrangement, even in our own sector or some other sectors. And definitely, when it goes to the usage of personal data, is only opt-in, what is allowed. There is no other way. This new law, for example, prohibits the service provider to make phone calls to their users to promote some, commercial packages and so on, if it has not the previous consent of the user. And so we are working very much into that direction. And we are also trying to promote more topics on cybersecurity. Because cybersecurity is a responsibility that must be shared among all the actors involved. On the one hand, governments, on the other one, private sector companies, and consumers. The consumers must at least, use some basic programs to protect themselves. But in order to have that, governments and carriers must collaborate to create conscience on them, to protect their information. In the private sector, it is very important to have this security by design principle that I was mentioning, and we all must increase our efforts to do that, especially regarding devices and social networks, so that we can increase the confidence and the consumer experience when using those. And in governments, it is very important to create the appropriate legal framework to protect information. As I said before, in Mexico we still have to do a lot of work on how are we going to share that information for public security issues. And also, governments needs to collaborate with other states in order to close those loopholes where the cyber criminals might be acting, given the international nature of the internet.
So, Jorge, I hear two things you're pointing to. Certainly, one is data is part of a whole kind of value chain, and partners will use it in different ways. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about partnering, and then the other, which I think is highly relevant, is the notion of the right kind of balance with government regulation and how we think about that on a country by country basis, and some of the scale. As multinationals, as many of you are, that challenge of looking at each government creating their own model and maybe finding some kind of principles or framework that can allow them to work maybe better together, but still recognize that there are cultural and protectionist needs of citizens in each country, and how we might work with that. But maybe let's talk a little bit more about some of the partnering capabilities. So you certainly mentioned one, and being able to create a value for that. Joel also kind of mentioned, talking about Helsinki and kind of partnering with them and showing them opportunities. Dana, other models that you see where partnering could be quite successful and contributory to growth in data and data usage?
Yes, absolutely. Partnership is a big theme for us, and leveraging data in those partnerships, governmental partnerships, private partnerships, etc. One of the things that we know from insights and data is a pain point and a need for governments around the globe is the need for the safe distribution, safe, reliable distribution, getting to the right person for social benefits, by example. So MasterCard's done quite a few partnerships around the globe to assist governments in getting social benefits to the right person. We've done deals in South Africa where through carrying biometric information and being able to provide a form factor, a card in this case, to individuals that money from the government can be pushed to the right person, validated by biometrics, was a very important problem to solve. MasterCard helped through also some private partnerships to be able to enable the safe distribution of social benefits in South Africa. Similarly, in Nigeria, working with governments on identity cards, national identity cards. India is pushing on national identity cards, etc. To be able to use data, biometrics, various forms of authenticating consumers and individuals to be able to create those partnerships and leverage technology and data assets are very important. I mentioned that social good is really important to us, and we also have done some partnerships with NGOs. I'm very proud of the partnership that we have with the World Food Program, which is oriented around fighting world hunger and being able to leverage data, leverage technology, leverage partnerships and assets that are, the 1 + 1 = 3, where we can help aid the World Food Program in the area of what we call digital food. So instead of trying to ship produce and food that's perishable to places that really need it, we can help provide products and capability that enables a small business owner in the locale to be able to create and develop their own financial situation, and enable benefactors to be able to use payment products to get that food so they have fresh food. And then there's a small business entrepreneurism that's grown in that locale, and sustainable financial development. So those are some of the partnerships that we're really interested in helping governments and private sectors and individuals, consumers, merchants to grow financial development and safety and security of payments.
So both in the business supply chain, being able to support new ways of helping customers feel safe, even if it's other partners' customers, and the ability to use data actually for social good, for a greater cause. And in fact, in many of the cases, you're even talking about some of the same data sets and how they can get purposed into a variety of things, which of course always brings up then the question, if we do agree, if there is agreement on the notion of a opt-in, or at least a consent-based approach to data, and then you look at the complexity of partnerships and bringing it together, could we foresee all of the intents that should have been written in the consent? And if not, do we go back to people who provided data and ask for consent? And I think that's a big question. I'm looking at the time, and I would love to debate that more. So what I'm going to ask each of you with that last point I made is any closing remarks. Just think of a minute, 90 seconds, any last minute thing you'd like to get out. So Joel, as you're there, I'll go to you.
That's great. Along that partnership topic, I'd like to close just with the thought of, there's so much information that's available today. I do agree that it should be an opt-in model for sharing specific information if there's some identifiable information. What we do find is there's a lot of non-identifiable information that can be aggregated and then used in some sort of data sets. We see this with open government data sets around the world. We see it at the central government or the federal government level. We see it at the state, at the city level. In Mexico, Mexico has actually been a big proponent of open government and sharing the data sets that are out there. And one of the things that I'll encourage you to do, and even offer a challenge, is take a look at the data sets that are available from the open government side, but also internally. Look at your data sets. And one of the partnership models that we've seen really taking hold is very similar to the concept of a hackathon, where you get a group of people to build applications that support the need for some gap, but it's along the lines of data. And so, for lack of a better term, we call it a datathon, which is you bring people that have interest in the data or in the outcomes of data together and let them see the data. And again, if it's identifiable data, then it should stay within the borders of the people that should see that. But what you find is the business users typically have a lot of interesting insight around the data. It's not just the traditional data scientists or that group of data people within the org, it's the business people that have that. If anybody's interested, I'm always glad to provide additional input. I'm Cherkis at Microsoft.com. Reach out to me and we can share some of the best practices that are there. But my approach is embrace the data that's out there today, start looking at it, start asking questions, or start looking at what questions may be answered just by looking at that data.
Thank you, Joel. Dana?
I guess my closing comments, we're talking about leveraging data to help us with data-driven insights, with business insights, with growth, with protectionism, with consumer value, et cetera. It's really diversifying our points of view and providing greater insights to us. I'm going to sort of parlay that comment about diversification and put a plea and an ask out for all of you and your companies and where you work every day. We need diversification of thinking in technology. We need women in technology. Women are dropping out of technology. If I could just make a plea for you to think about that in your corporations, in your companies. We need data scientists. We need business analysts. We need coders. We need project managers. There's a lot of different skills in the technology industry for women. Girls drop out of STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, math, at somewhere around the 5th grade. We have to educate our girls about the diversification of jobs in the technology field for them. Just sort of wrapping that into big data, because that's diversification of thinking, and that's what data is all about. So I put that plea and ask out for each one of you to think about that and see what you can do to make a difference in that space.
Diversification. Thank you, Dana. Fan club there too, yes.
Thank you. It's important.
Jorge,
Okay,
last
thank
90
you. Well, I
seconds.
would like to say a word more on this issue that you mentioned, on creating this level playing field for all the actors in the digital ecosystem. This principle of same services, same rules that I mentioned for data protection should be applied in general for all the services provided in this ecosystem. And by that, by no means we want everybody to be regulated the same way carriers are regulated. On the contrary, we need a whole new regulation, a regulation that's forward-looking, in which the regulator and policymakers have clear objectives, targets, what they want from all the stakeholders involved in the process, and let us do our best job in order to reach them. We believe it is the time to rely more on competition and ex post competition law to correct whatever goes wrong. Many of the issues, highly controversial at this time, could be solved if we truly increase competition, if there are alternatives of service provision to the consumer, to the consumers. So that's what we truly mean.
So,
Thank you.
And by forward thinking, you mean beyond the next election cycle, I suspect. Last 90 seconds, Joe.
So I'll just briefly, I wanted to comment on your point about if there's a new application of the data, what should we do in terms of our existing agreements with the people whose data we're using. And I think in the electronic age, where everyone can be contacted electronically, it's not that much trouble to go back and ask them and say, we've discovered this new application for the data, is this okay with you? I don't think that's too much to ask. Thank you.
That's good. All right, so let me just conclude in the next 30 seconds. The world of personal data is both complex and constantly changing. I think we heard some of that here. While some of the required technological and legal frameworks will take time to develop, organizations can act now to develop common and straightforward ways to communicate with individuals. So I think that was Bill's point right there, as well as reorienting risk control procedures around user needs. I think we talked a bit about that as well. Personal data is a valuable asset, and has been used to create significant social and economic value, and taking reasonable steps to strengthen trust can help ensure that this continues. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.